Hi, I'm Jack Boudreau. I'm the CEO and co-founder of www.usehabits.com, where everyone finds their financial advisor. But you may have seen me on LinkedIn, TikTok, or Instagram because I'm an avid content creator in the startup space. But I started my professional career in 2017 through the JP Morgan Analyst Program and was cutting my teeth there for a few years and eventually led the Financial Institutions Group team in Chicago, where I'm originally from. And I'm super excited to be with you here today. You've now learned the startup fundamentals of finance. Think about break even, CAC, client acquisition cost, or anything that makes or impacts the dollars behind your startup. But the problem is a lot of people build these really fancy big time financial models, but they don't validate or challenge it with the day-to-day operations of their actual startup. So what we're going to do here today is to help you walk through the assumptions that you're going to make, not only for forecasting, but also for trying to tackle what would be the right price point, what would be the right go-to-market strategy, or who are the people that you need on your team to deliver the high quality service that we all know you want to do. The lean startup approach is all about taking real life examples in the day-to-day interactions with your customers, with your employees, and maybe potential financiers. But at the very end of the day, when you're building this, you need to consider a few different things. And that's why one thing I want to do in particular is think about that very first lemonade stand that you ran as a kid. Think about the ingredients that you bought, the support or people that helped you put it together. Think about the time of day. Think about the neighborhood you were in. Think about the other people that walked by. Were they your ideal customers? Were they people just waving along? Were they people in their cars? Were they people who stopped and paid? And what was the sign that you used? What was the messaging? Like, it may sound a lot more complicated when you're putting together a financial model, but it's as simple as a lemonade stand. Now, this section might be one of the most important. Building assumptions for your financial model is both tricky and difficult because when you're super early on in your journey, you may not have all the answers. So maybe at this point, your financial model is meant to be more of a calculator or maybe help you better understand what's working and not working. But ultimately, you want it to be a tool for you, your team, your potential investors, and really to tell the story more from the numbers perspective of ultimately what your startup is doing. So while building your assumptions, think about, okay, how are you going to acquire customers, right? That client acquisition cost. Think about marketing, SEO. Do you need to go to events? Are you going to be doing social media ads? These are all costs and expenditures that get you clicks and eyeballs onto your website or onto your product. Also think about the salaries and wages. You know, in this day and age, like if you want to attract top talent and the people that you need to evangelize your platform to the next level, how much are you going to compensate them? Are you going to give them equity into your business? Are you going to give them benefits? Also, do you have to factor in if they're working overseas or if they're a contractor or if they're a full-time employee? Like, these things all might sound very complicated, but in the beginning, you don't need to make that complicated. And that's where assumptions kind of come into this. So one example that I would think for you and for your team or wherever you are right now in your journey, think about, okay, how much does it ultimately cost us to keep the product alive? How much does it cost us with the current team that we have to, get this thing out there and to keep it stable and to also maybe incrementally improve it over time? And then maybe think about the dollars that you need to fund these operations, whether that's through bootstrapping and just selling your product or service, or whether that's raising capital from friends, family, VC funds, corporate venture arms, or whoever else is crazy enough to invest in your idea at the moment. But the bottom line being, think basic and simple and put a number in, but recognize every week you're going to be challenging and thinking this through every step of the way. So here are maybe some very ultimate examples. Think about, how much does it cost per click to get someone onto your website? Think about, what is the average salary of a first sales employee for your business? Think about the commissions that you might offer to those sales professionals as they sell certain services or products that apply to your startup. Think about, well, with the amount of capital that we're going to raise over the next 2 years, how long is that going to sustain us with the operating costs, with the data infrastructure costs? Think about how much it costs to host all of your data on Microsoft Azure or on AWS or wherever it is ultimately your product is sitting and applying to in the day-to-day life of your customers. Customer feedback is integral, and I know this is not the first time you're hearing that. But when building your financial model, all those assumptions that we just discussed, you really got to test them in the real world. So as a personal example, in the early days of Habits, I kid you not, you could have found me in the summer of 2022 on the streets of Boston, basically holding up a poster board saying, let me pitch you my startup. Because think about it, our target demographic is predominantly people between the ages of 25 and 45, but we also sell to financial advisors. And that marketplace dynamic doesn't apply to maybe you and your startup, but it does apply in the sense of better understanding and getting in front of those audiences that apply to your target demographic. And what I would do in those cases is basically ask all the difficult questions. What would get them to download our app? What would get them to go onto our website? What would get a financial advisor to take a bet on us and to join our platform? These were all very difficult questions and things that I needed to hear. And you can begin to imagine when you expose yourself, it can be intimidating, but it's very important. And let me share maybe a couple different reasons why. First and foremost, price sensitivity is critical. I talked about the refundable deposit in the previous example, but for families, right now we don't monetize from them. For them though, I'm basically charging their time. It may not always be dollars that are integral to your startup, but it may also be the time and the attention that you can get from your users. So I had to ask them, what would get you to go to usehabits.com? What would get you to think about or wanting a financial advisor? And would you pay for this? Would you not pay for this? But then the second part of this conversation comes from, did they actually pull out their wallet? And when they did, what did they say? Did they have an excuse? Did they follow through? And once they paid, did they really engage with it? When it came time to renewal season, did they churn? Did they renew? Did they upgrade? These are all things that are critical for you when building your assumption and building your financial model. And last but not least, as your startup grows, this is going to be more and more important, not only for raising capital, but also for your internal team members to figure out, well, is engagement staying high? If we tweak this or tweak that, will that get more engagement? If we maybe consider this different price point or a freemium model or a SaaS approach, can that actually get us in front of new audiences that can help us grow our reach? All of which come back to customer feedback. Along your journey, you may find that it's really costly to bring people through the door. You may realize that things aren't working, engagement is lacking, and you can tell by the tone of my voice that this is a really uncomfortable seat to be in, because when the numbers of your startup aren't really working in your direction, you may have to start to think about, does it make sense to pivot? And the reason why I say that is because notice that I said that with a bit of a question mark, because only really you and your team are ultimately going to know that. It helps to talk to customers. Your investors maybe have a thing or two to say. Friends and family or people close to your startup may also add their 2 cents. But at the end of the day, this comes down to you and your team and what you ultimately believe is going to move the needle for whatever your mission is, whatever your value prop. But also recognize that maybe what you started might be something totally different. And there are plenty of examples about this in the real world, even using Habits as an example. In the beginning, we were trying to charge people anywhere between $100 to over $1,000 to help them find a financial advisor, to which they came to us and said, are you kidding me? You're going to charge me to have you help me go do something? Because that made all the sense in the world in my head. But when we actually were trying to get this done, nobody was paying. Drop off was immediate. But this also happened when we built some fancy onboarding flows and we really wanted to bring people through the platform through a mobile app or through a web app or through a website or through a co-branded landing page. And we learned so much about all these dollars and money being put towards initiatives that actually didn't get us more customers, or if anything got us less, or if anything made our revenue lower, or if anything didn't make us, okay, I'm gonna do this a lot better and it's gonna be shorter and sweeter. One of the most difficult things to have to consider with your startup is, do you need to pivot? You may be looking at your financial model today and you may notice that revenue is flat. You may notice that your client acquisition costs are pretty high and they're not getting lower. Heck, maybe even your investors are telling you that there's a huge opportunity if you were to move into a different target demographic, or maybe slightly change your pricing tier, or maybe change your product and service entirely. But at the very end of the day, that's why it's so important with your financial model to be tracking all of these things. And think of just maybe a simple example. In my previous one, I'd mentioned that from a pricing tier perspective, we had kind of changed the way that we had engaged with some financial advisors. But on the customer engagement perspective, we had this mobile app for Habits with a really fancy but long onboarding flow. It took customers upwards of 2 to 3 minutes before they could even start to see the utility of their experience. And what we began to recognize was all of those dollars that we put in towards building that onboarding flow and all the evidence that we felt like it made all the sense in the world to keep it, our customers didn't like it, and they weren't returning, and they weren't completing the onboarding flow, and they were stopping halfway through. And that's when we began to say to ourselves, well, should we maybe change this? Is there a maybe more expensive alternative that gets people more through the door? Or maybe do we just need to trim some of the costs that are going towards this and really just kind of simplify it? And you want to know what? It ended up being a combination of the two, but all of which were derived from us both talking to our users, but then looking back at our financial model and actually starting to say to ourselves, if we move forward with this pivot, how will that impact for us at scale? How will that impact for us as we forecast future cash flows down the road? All of which you have to think about and your team has to think about week to week, month to month, with all the new feedback that you get from your users and end-to-end engagements of your platform, product, or service. There's probably a lot that's going through your head right now. Both numbers, maybe how you operate your business, maybe some potential changes that you want to make. But nonetheless, hopefully what you took away from this is that a financial model is only as good as the tool that you make it to be. And whether that's based on customer feedback, asking them the right price points, asking and figuring out from your team what's actually getting people through the door, other ways that can help you forecast the future, whether you're trying to raise a big round of capital, or maybe you're just trying to make sense of what the last 3 months entailed for you guys and how that differs from the past 6 to 12 months, right? Startups is always about waking up every day and finding out how can I get 0.1% better. And I think whether you have a business degree or not, or wherever you come from in the world, we can all universally understand that. Which is why the one thing that I really want you guys to consider before you head to the next section where you'll be diving into marketing, I want you to think about 1 or 2 things that you can change about your business. And if you can't change something, what are 1 or 2 things that you can experiment this week? And how you can leverage your financial model to help you challenge that thesis to maybe see if maybe it does make sense for you and your business in the long run, or maybe it makes sense for it right now. Because once again, it's all about just getting a little bit better incrementally each day.